Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. My name is Vincent Burke, and I am a student at UCCS and staff member at UCCS Downtown. Thank you for joining us today on our third and final session for our Hamilton series. I will be speaking with Dr. Kimbra Smith from the Anthropology Department and Dr. Kevin Landis from the Visual and Performing Arts Department. Both are going to be discussing today the production of Hamilton itself and the future of inclusive theater storytelling. Thank you both for joining us.
Thank you.
So just a quick disclaimer, as usual, we are hoping that viewers have seen either the production or the Disney Plus sort of film that they put out for it. And without further ado, we're going to kind of jump into some questions. Can the both of you tell us a little bit about your I guess, involvement in theater?
Kimbra, do you want to start?
Sure. I'm an applied anthropologist as well as a cultural anthropologist, and I've worked with communities in Spain, in the US, and in Ecuador doing applied community theater, roughly based on theater of the oppressed work. So I'm really interested in practice theory and embodied practice and how experiencing something with the body is different from reading about it or theorizing about it otherwise. Kevin?
Yeah, and my name's Kevin Landis. I'm the director of the Theater and Dance program in the Department of Visual and Performing Arts. So I'm deeply involved in theater in that way, obviously. And in some ways similar to what Kimbra is saying, my dissertation work and a lot of my research was on Grotowski, who was a theater practitioner in Poland, and some of the antecedents and precedents for what he does, but a lot of physical embodiment, a lot of working in theater outside of a script and a set narrative, which I think will be relevant to some of the things we'll talk today about. And I also should just mention, full disclosure, I sort of moonlight as the researcher in residence at the Public Theater in New York, which is the place that Hamilton was originated.
Well, fantastic. It's very exciting to have both of you on. So let's get into some questions about Hamilton. What does the narrative and format of this production communicate to theater and streaming viewers sort of in the modern age?
I think that's a really interesting question, because to me, one of the things that stood out about this particular production was Miranda's conscious focus on an almost constant repetition of the word narrative, right? He's very consciously framing this as a narrative and focusing on the narrative as a guide to how we move through history, which it is, right? Our narratives do guide us through history. They do guide us to see history in particular in very limited ways. And by playing with this, I think he's expanding, the potential for history to be thought of differently. And that's, to me, what stands out about this. In the first session that you did, Dr. Bell mentioned, this is made for us, right? This is something that was made to be experienced by and celebrated by people of color, people who are not always included in the narrative. And, maybe these are not the historical figures I would have idealized. I'm not a huge fan of hero narratives in general. But opening the space to sort of poke the bear of history, I think, is really important. He uses the casting, he uses the different musical genres, he uses formats like streaming on Disney Plus to extend the access to a broader audience. And I think that's interesting, because now, to me, what that means is more of us can start to imagine through that narrative the roles that people of color have and have had always, in not just in our narratives, but in our history. And I think that's really important.
Yeah, absolutely. And that kind of leads us into the next question. Is Hamilton considered, or would either of you consider this Hamilton theater of the oppressed?
I'll take that. It's an interesting question, because you set up, because theater of the oppressed is a very specific thing. And if you don't mind my tangenting, taking a little tangent, if I could put it that way, about what theater of the oppressed is, that might help frame how we discuss Hamilton. Simple answer is no, Hamilton is not theater of the oppressed in the literal form. For those who may have heard of this idea, theater of the oppressed was a theater genre or style of way of approaching theater that was developed in the 1970s by a man named Augusto Boal, who Kimbra and I both have done a lot of research and use in our classes. And what Boal was getting at was, I mean, this goes back to narratives, as Kimbra was just talking about, but who gets to tell stories? Who can afford the mic, right? And allowing that to go away and saying we all have stories to tell, focusing on oppressed communities, but also allowing audience and practitioners to exist in the same place at the same time and blurring the lines between, if we're going to say Hamilton, Lin-Manuel Miranda, and the audience of people there. That doesn't happen in Hamilton, right? This is a story that is happening on a Broadway stage. Audiences are paying $500 to $1,000 to get a ticket. It's 2 hours and 45 minutes. There's a big closing number at the end of the act. The curtain goes down. In some ways, I love Hamilton, but in some ways, Hamilton stylistically is extremely traditional for a Broadway show. And there's huge amounts of money involved. In Theater of the Oppressed, Boal would go out into his communities and create theater amongst the population, not necessarily professional actors, sometimes. He had a style called forum theater, in which a story was told and an audience member could basically tag in and change the story and look at it from another perspective, to look at how oppression works in our societies. Or invisible theater was another form that he invented, or at least put a title to, in which something might happen, I might go down to Rico's tonight and create theater, in the midst of the people having dinner down there, and they don't know that I'm creating theater, and all of a sudden they're involved in a theatrical event. So in that sense, Hamilton is not theater of the oppressed. However, what Boal was trying to do with this is, in some ways, answer the question before it ever was asked at the end of Hamilton: who lives, who dies, who tells your story, and allowing audiences to be more a part of this, telling the stories of their lives. And I think, as we talk further about this, that might be some of the lessons that we take from Hamilton moving forward.
Yeah, I agree. I think, in the strict sense of theater of the oppressed, with that sort of audience engagement, no. But I think I agree with Kevin in its potentiality. I think perhaps because, again, going back to this idea of history, we tend to say, oh, those who don't know history are doomed to repeat it. And I think often it's actually those who do know history, who do know that sort of narrative framework of history. This is the accepted history that we're all familiar with. I think that makes us more doomed to repeat it than not knowing it, because we have this predetermined idea of how history can go, of what is possible. And part of what I think he's doing, it's not theater of the oppressed, but it is pushing that question of who can participate, who has the voice, who. And I love the piece with Eliza at the very end, where she comes forward and she says, I put myself back in the narrative, and she's, I think Miranda's almost leaving it open. It's like, okay, so what would this look like in a different iteration if it were told by the women, or if it were if it were told by a different group? How does history look different from different perspectives? And I think he's at least just pushing that question at us so we can start to consider it. And I think the breadth of the audience just makes that, so much more powerful.
Well, and so the exciting, if I might jump in really quick, the exciting thing about what you're saying, Kimbra, and what I was thinking about is the question about how is Hamilton going to transform theater is often a question. The answer is I don't know. Broadway audiences haven't evolved that much, sadly, a little bit. But it's these sorts of forums, right? 5 years later, you thought it important, and I think it is, to have a forum and have, over the course of a month, talk about the lessons that we learned from Hamilton. That's what's powerful about it, because let's just assume most people in our society don't go to New York and spend exorbitant amounts of money on a massive show like this. So its distribution on Disney Plus is a huge deal, and it'll be interesting to see how that affects the trajectory of theater going forward, especially in a pandemic. But then the questions that I think it gave rise to, which is, wait a minute, how do I tell my story? How do I take back that mic, to use the metaphor I was using earlier, and say, no, this is what I want to say?
Mm-hmm.
Well, that works out pretty well for the next question, which is talking about some of the modern or some methods that we can use. And this kind of goes out to both of you again. Or what are some methods of performance theater that can be used to highlight voices of subjected elements in our societies? And how can the general public then support these sort of artistic structures?
I think there's lots of ways, and I know, Kimbra, I know you've got a lot to say about this as well. But I think trying to figure out, and this is why in this moment of pandemic and lockdown and not knowing what the future holds, that this is an extremely important question, because arts institutions financially are decimated. You're going to see theater companies all over the country close down at rates that'll just be shocking. And all of those people still having stories to tell and still wanting to tell them, figuring out how to do what theater does best, which is on a very small budget, gathering people in a small group, maybe around a table, maybe in a small amphitheater, and telling the stories that are important to those people at that time. Not necessarily paying a lot of money to go to, the cathedral on the hill. And I include, hey, we have this beautiful building at UCCS, the Ent Center. I love it, but it's literally a shiny silver building on a hill. I mean, how do we say, let's take theater and relocate it into the communities that make our society so rich and vibrant? And I think those are the questions that a lot of theater companies are asking at this time, because we can do that. How can we as theater practitioners facilitate conversations, not necessarily say, hey, I'm coming into this community, whatever it happens to be, and you're going to help me tell my story. But I'm going to help because I have a little bit of a platform, help you tell the story that you want to tell. And we can go on and on about it. There's lots of companies doing that right now.
Yeah, and that kind of goes back to theater of the oppressed as well. The whole point of that was to create spaces to practice different responses. And are there ways to kind of blur the lines between these different genres or these different approaches to theater? Caitlin Lowens from TheaterWorks and I have been talking about a hum course in spring where we are basically following up on a course I'm teaching this fall and trying to do local documentary history into theater. So TheaterWorks is, I don't know if this is news to you, Kevin, probably not, but doing an Anna Devere Smith piece this fall, which is documentary theater. And, are there ways, even if we're online, right? How do you can you get different voices telling stories? And how do you do that effectively if you're not physically in the theater, if you're not physically engaging with other people? I just had a meeting yesterday with a company that produces an app that's for artists to sculpt them into different shapes so the artist can draw them. And I was like, you could use this for theater. You could use this to create, to play some of the games that Boal played in theater. You could use this to set up the theater before people have to be physically present in COVID. So there are just lots of ways we could be creative with, but how do we get the community voices involved and engaged? And again, I think expanding the exposure to theater, as Kevin says, not everyone's going to, I love theater. Do I go pay to see it on Broadway? No. getting that broader audience and getting people thinking about what's possible through theater and what kinds of stories can be told. I think that's, that's fascinating. And that's something that I'm really excited about the potential for.
Kimbra, it seems to me there's also this aspect, I mean, back to the question about how do we get audiences sort of bought in. I think we have to, I was going to say get rid of, but not get rid of, maybe compartmentalize the sort of contemporary fetishization of the professional theater, right? I am a professional actor. I am a professional actor. There's nothing wrong with it. Those are good things. But how many people in our society, when they say, can you act? Like, oh, no, I can't do that. I'm not an artist. Like, no, we're all artists because we're human beings. We're a creative force and we have stories to tell. So whenever someone says I'm not an actor, I'm like, no, you are. Stop saying that. Having audiences buy into the fact that there is a responsibility, there's a community responsibility to create stories, to give light to stories. I'm not going to tell a patron who wants to go and sit in the dark and watch a show that that's wrong. I think that's great. I said, let's compartmentalize that as one form of theater. This community action theater is about all of us creating in the same space and saying, no, it's important. I might not be a professional actor on the Broadway stage, but I have something to say.
And also, I think the other component of that is it's not fixed theater. So the whole purpose of it, it's not like, am I doing this, this iconic play right or wrong, as if there is a right or wrong, right? It's about how do we reenact or how do we play with the stories that we have to tell, and how do we play with them in multiple ways? How do we see how we feel if we push it in this direction or if we push it in that direction? And that's kind of the power of theater of the oppressed. It's the space to try out alternative endings or to leave endings kind of inchoate. You don't know what's going to happen next, but what direction? How do we shift this a little bit in this direction by making this microscopic change? Does it change anything in the outcome? And giving people a place to play with that when they're not necessarily professionals. I think, that's very liberating. That's one of the most fun things about doing that with communities and one of the most sort of emotionally powerful.
And it sort of demystifies the, theater, quote unquote, right? So that, we like this thing that I can't approach. I'll pay some money and go see it. But it's like, no, it's for all of us. So demystifying the theater, I think, is one of the things we can do, especially now that theater doesn't have any money and we can't put on big productions. It's just impossible.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I was just thinking about Kevin, you were mentioning earlier, how about we're all sort of actors in the grand process. And again, it was the sort of, you are sort of acting out a way by sitting there and watching it. You're acting out a very specific action that you're designated to do, and don't deviate from that. You've got to do this or else you're going to be breaking it. And it's just
a lot of rules around theater, which we can get rid of.
Well, and that's so with that, sort of breaking the rules again, we were just talking about it. Do either of you expect to see any other North American myths of Genesis recalibrated or, recommunicated due to the success of Hamilton?
I don't know if I would make it that linear. I don't, well, here's Hamilton and therefore these are the next 6 things, but in the sense of thinking more openly, more flexibly, more inclusively about history. Is the history that we repeat ad nauseum in grade school really history is different. Every single person is going to have a different perspective, even on their own, the history that they have lived. How can we possibly distill a nation down into one singular tiny narrative? And yet we always do, right? Every nation does this. So again, I think one of the exciting things is we're at a moment that I think we are questioning some of that history for various reasons, Hamilton being only one of the factors playing into that. And, can we open up our understandings of, or what we're willing to accept as a possible history or as a possible narrative? And how do we play with that? How do we play with that collectively? And, understanding that, history is not a thing that is set in stone, that's sacrosanct, that we can't reimagine.
If I could give an example, I think this is actually relevant to the question, maybe. The public theater that I mentioned before, which is where Hamilton started, one of the big initiatives that they're doing, and I know a lot of theater companies around the country are thinking about this, is a program called Public Works, in which several people, members of the public theater, full-time job, work with community partners around the major boroughs in New York City that have been identified. And they don't necessarily, they spend all year working with them, not necessarily on doing acting classes, but just getting to know them, doing some acting classes, doing work. And acting as perhaps a facilitator for social interaction. And what happens, and the most sort of visible part of this Public Works program, is at the end of the summer, they turn over the Delacorte Theater in Central Park to an adaptation, often of a big, great script, like the Odyssey or something. And all of these people that they've been working with over the course of the year are cast. They're on stage, and they bring whatever it is that they want to bring to the show. So midway through the show, which has been adapted with music, the marching band from, I don't know, the Bronx or wherever that group happens to be. I remember them vividly. I don't remember where they were from. Comes on stage. Does it make sense in the original script? No, but it doesn't matter, because they're taking these stories and saying, we're reevaluating these stories and making them relevant in New York City, in 2000. Whenever that was. And I think a lot of communities are latching onto that, saying, yeah, let's reimagine this wonderful script in our community right now.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, kind of off the cuff, do either of you think find it healthy for societies to be able to kind of pull history this way or that way with performances?
Yeah. like change.
The short answer, yes.
Yeah, I think so. I think Hamilton showed that, don't you, Kimbra?
Yeah, because I think, the reason we have these, kind of monolithic formal narratives of history is that they support certain structures of who is likely to have a voice and who's likely to be perceived as, validly having a voice. Right, who's justified in having that voice. And if we can begin to challenge that, or just to encourage people to see history more flexibly, that creates already a space for, a more inclusive understanding, not just of history, but of who are we as a community, who are we as a people? Why are so many voices silenced throughout history, and what would they add to the story if we could hear those pieces? And yeah,
I hope Hamilton and all of these examples that we've given allows us to break out of the preciousness of history. I'm a historian, I love history, but the preciousness of history within the milieu of theater, because theater is for us right now. The whole point is that we're together in a space live, so it's for us. So how do we make it more relevant for us? If we bend history a little bit, so be it.
Absolutely.
Or reinterpret it. I don't bend theater, but history, but reinterpret it. Say, this is what I'm latching onto. This is what means something to me. Sharing the mic.
Absolutely. Well, we've got one last question kind of on here. We have a little bit extra time, and again, out to both of you. How will access to these more inclusive art forms, theater in this context for Hamilton, impact pop culture, or how do you suspect it will? And how does then, I guess, pop culture influence society in this way?
Oh gosh. Do you have I have thoughts. I don't know. The answer is I don't know. What do you think, Kimbra?
I mean, I feel like I'm repeating myself a little, but I do think that, you know, something that is more broadly accessible and generating conversations, just the numbers. What were the numbers that you were talking about? Like 700 something thousand people
saw
Hamilton in the first 3 days it was streaming. Anything that large as a popular phenomenon is generating conversation. So if we're having conversations about alternative versions or alternative forms or alternative interpretations or even misinterpretations of history, you know, that's including more people in a conversation. And I think it's the conversations that are going to shift, you know, the idea that, yeah, I have a place in this conversation. I can participate. I have an opinion. I can, you know, that's, you know, you look concerned, Kevin.
No, I totally agree with you, but I'm also, of course I agree with you. No, the question of pop cultural is interesting because it's kind of, let's be fair to Lin-Manuel Miranda and that whole team to just identify the fact that this musical is extraordinary. It is perhaps, I mean, I would count it as one of the 6 or 7 most important musicals ever created, and that's only 5 years out. So to say that let's figure out what's going to recreate this phenomenon, it's like phenomena are not recreated. I mean, this thing is its thing. So there isn't going to be another Hamilton. There will be something else that transforms the way we think about theater. But it's not going to be in the pop cultural mold that Hamilton is, especially, and I keep going back to this, now that theater has transformed right now, and who knows how long it'll last, but transformed entirely.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that was absolutely fantastic. And I think that's about all the time we have for today. So, you know, I think that this really, both of you and the other sessions as well, has just really proven the sort of caliber we have for faculty at UCCS, by the way. So for all of our viewers, just to know that, I think it's really important. And I just want to thank both of you again for joining us on this session.
Thank you for doing this.
Yes, of course. We hope to be doing it more in the future because this sort of interdisciplinary, cross-discipline approach to these topics that are so just at hand is just so important, I think. Again, to have everyone join in the discussion here, we need to be able to give people the tools to actually engage in it. So if any of our viewers have any questions, please send us an email at downtown@uccs.edu, and we'll be happy to send those to our guests. So thank you again for joining us.
Thank you.
So the UCCS Downtown team would like to thank all of our guests that have come on and viewers for joining us in this session. We hope that you all had as good of a time as we did, and we really did have a fantastic time here. Hamilton really is, again, a phenomenon. It's a major pop culture phenomenon, and to discuss it with all of you has been an absolute pleasure. And we love analyzing all the disciplines and being able to come at this from all the different views. It's so important. And so again, thank you all the viewers for joining us. To enjoy more content like this, please follow the university and UCCS Downtown on our Facebook and Instagram profiles. Thank you all and have a great weekend.